Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moikins from Big Mountain Studio. If you're interested in iOS development, then subscribe, click on that bell icon, and you'll get notified when I come out with new tutorials. In this next part, you're going to learn how to edit activities by doing a row swipe, showing a pop-up, and then updating that activity and then saving it. Now we've done a lot of these actions before, so this will mostly be a review. Since it's a review, I won't be coding everything from new. I originally tried it that way, and this tutorial is running over an hour long. And I wasn't even halfway done yet. So, in the interest of time, I'll be presenting the new code with plenty of comments, and then we'll review it together. And we're going to spend some time talking about the more complicated actions or problems that I've uncovered. Okay, so let's take a look at these actions that we're going to be taking in this video. First, we want to update the model to include an update function for activities. Then, we want to create the table swipe action so we can edit an activity. And then we already have a pop-up for adding new activities, so we're going to reuse that to support updating. And then once we click the save on that pop-up, we want to call our new update function that we added in step number 1. And that save function in step number 4, that save function will actually update it on our data source. And it might be a remote data source in this case. So after that is updated, we don't want to make a call and update the whole table view. So what we want to do is we want to just update that local data variable so we don't have to reload the whole table view. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to reflect these changes on the table view because when we're updating an activity, we might move it to a different day. So let's talk about this a little bit, this flow of how this works. I want to give you an overview of the steps because moving an activity from one day to another is kind of tricky. Imagine this scenario. We'll edit an existing activity, we'll change the day, save it, and then we want it to show up under a new day, just like you see here. And remember, activities are in an array under days. So if we move an activity from one day to another, then here's what we'll have to do. First, we'll have to delete the old activity from the old days array. And second, we want to insert the new activity into the new days array. And lastly, we want to reflect those changes in the table view by deleting and inserting just the rows that are affected. And like I said before, we're not going to be reloading the whole table view because we don't have to. And we want to prevent as many data calls as we can to save money if our data store is on a remote server. Always try to prevent unnecessary data calls. This will improve performance and save you money. It'll also save your users time and money if they have to pay for that data. All right, we'll get started by adding an update function to our activity model. Now, before we do that, let's just update our tasks. And the reason why I keep bringing you guys back here is because this can really help you, whether you work independently or at a company, this can really help you manage your tasks. And I even had another developer tell me that he started using this because his boss had no idea what he was doing. So now his boss can come into this board and see everything that he's working on and everything he's completed. Then that way it's not so much of a mystery. So we've already deleted activities, and now we're going to be working on edit activities. Okay, so let's take a look at these list of actions again, so we can go through this step by step. Now the first thing we're going to look at is the activities functions because we need something to do an update for the activity. Okay, so we're in the activities function, and let's take a look at the code that I added. So here's the new update activity function. And as you can see, it takes a lot of the same parameters as delete activity. We have to know what trip we're on. And then for the next two parameters, we have an old day index and a new day index. Why do we have these? Because remember, an activity can move from one day to another. So we need to know, where did you come from? And where are you going to? What day were you in? And what new day are you going in? Now, sometimes these indexes can be exactly the same because the activity isn't going to move from day to day. And that's fine. And then the last parameter we have is the activity model. And this basically just has all the data for the activity. Let me update one thing here. I just noticed there's an extra space. So I like to clean up my code here. All right. So let's see what's happening here. If the old day index doesn't equal the new day index, then we know that this activity is going to move from one day to another. And if they are the same, then we're just going to update the activity inside the same day. So here's where it gets kind of complicated. If an activity is moving to a new day, where in that new day is it going to go? We don't know. Because remember, take a look at that pop-up that comes up. You can select a new day, but you can't tell it where within that day you want the new activity to go. So what we're going to do is we're just going to move it to the last index here. We're going to move it right at the bottom of the day. And you might be asking yourself, well, that's not really optimal. I'd like the user to be able to move it within a day. Well, that's true. We do want that. But that's going to be in a future video where I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, now that we have the index of where this activity is going to go, we are going to call this function, this reorder activity function. And this is basically broken out because in the future video where I show you how to reorder these activities, we're going to use this function right here. Okay, so you can see the parameters here. We have the old day index and the new day index. And for step 1, basically all I'm doing is I'm just getting the day model, so I don't have to type out this whole line of like going into the data, getting the trip, with the trip index and getting the day. So this day model that I'm getting is actually the old day, I guess you could call it. And you know what? Maybe just for consistency, we'll change that to old day model. Yeah, I think that makes more sense because I'm kind of using this old day index, this old convention, and the new convention. So old day model, that's where it's coming from. And we get the index of the activity. And we're going to need that because when we remove it, we have to know remove it from what index. What are we removing? So we do the removal right here. We go into the activities model and we pull it out. Second step is just to take that activity and stick it into the new day. So that's what we do. We have the new day index and then we insert it. And remember, this new activity index, that's just the bottom of the array. We're just appending it to the bottom of the array. Now I want to show you guys something here. I could have done something like this. There's an append where we can just append it right to the bottom. and so that might be easier, right? But in the future video, like I said, we're going to be using this function to do reordering. And so when we reorder, we're not always going to be appending it to the bottom of the array. Or it might be index 0, at the beginning of the array. So that's why we can't do an append right here. We're just going to do an insert. Okay, that is the hardest part. So just remember, when you're moving something from one day to the next, there's always those 2 steps. Remove it from the old location, insert it into the new location. Now this else part is pretty easy. If it's just within the same day, then I get the day model just so I don't have to type out this whole thing again. And once I have that day model, I get the location of where that activity is in that array. So we're looking at the day's activity model, and then I get the first index of this activity. And once I have that, I can go to that location and replace the old activity model. So really, when we do an update, we're kind of like just replacing the old activity with a new activity with the data that has changed. All right, great. So that's step 1. We can cross that off our list. Now let's go into the table view and look at the leading swipe action. Okay, we're going to head down to the activities view controller here. And we'll find the leading swipe action. And it is right here. Okay, now this is kind of big, so I'll walk you through it. But one of the parts here we're actually not going to cover. So leading swipe action, as you may remember, is we create a contextual action and we tell it if it's going to be normal. And the other option is just destructive. So there's only 2 of them, normal and destructive. This is going to be normal. And the title will be edit. It'll have the edit name on there. And then you notice if we just go all the way down here, it does have an image and you can't see it. So we have to double click it to get it to show up. There we go. It's a pencil. And then we give it a background color. We already have this color defined because we set up this color when we were editing trips. Okay, good. Now inside of this function, when the button is tapped, when this edit button is tapped, we create our view controller from the add activities view controller. And right now, this view controller is just being used to add new activities. But we're going to reuse it and populate it with an activity that we can edit. So some of these things were already on there. We set a trip model, and here, let's just add a comment to that because I forgot to add a comment here. Okay, and then we also have the trips index. We're reusing an existing function that we already created in a previous video. And then what day are we on? Well, the days are marked with the index path section, and the days are marked with the index path.row. So remember, when you're looking at the screen, all the sections are days, and all the activities are rows within those sections. So they correlate perfectly with our data model. Okay, and then which activity are we editing? So we just go through our trip model, we go through our days, and we look at the section to get the right day, and then we look at the activities model, and then we get which row we're on. And then we set the model. Now, some of these are new properties that I created that we needed to be able to edit. And then this next part, I created a callback function, done editing, and this is what we want to have happen after they click save. And what happens after you click save is actually the next step. So right now, we're just on creating that swipe action. So we're going to skip over that part. It's kind of big. And then once we have set all those properties, then we're going to present that pop-up. And then we call action performed. And if you remember, action performed, what that does, it tells the table view that the user tapped that button that was exposed from the swipe action. And so if you call it, it'll move the row back into its position. Otherwise, if you don't call this, it just keeps that edit button exposed. Okay, and like we said before, we set the image, give it a background color, and then we return this swipe action, this edit button. It's an array. We can add more actions to it if we want, but I think edit is all we really need right now. Okay, so that covers the swipe action. We can cross number 2 off our list, and let's take a look at number 3. Let's see how we're going to change this pop-up to support updating or editing. Okay, we're going to come down here to the view controller for add activity. And notice I didn't really have to make any changes to the storyboard. It's mostly all code. Okay, so here are the new properties for editing activities. We pass in the day index that we're on, the activity model that we're going to edit, and I did pass in the whole model. There's no problem with doing this. Okay, done updating. That is our callback function, and this is what we call after we're done updating. Well, more specifically, it's when the user taps that save button. Okay, now let's take a look at the view did load. When they first come in here, we're going to examine some properties here, mainly the day index to edit and the activity model to edit. We want to check if they have values. If they have values, then we know that what we have here is an edit mode or an update mode. So we change the title of the pop-up to edit activity. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to select which day we're on. So the day picker view has a function, select row, and this function is pretty simple. You just pass in the index of which row you want to select. So we just use our day index, and then you say what component. And remember, the components in a picker view are like the columns. They're the individual columns that you can spin up and down. We only have one column, so this is going to be pretty easy. It's just component 0, and we'll say animated true. Even though that's set to animated true, I never actually see it spin when the pop-up comes up, so maybe that happens before the pop-up even shows. Okay, and then as you can see, we set the 2 text fields from the activity model, the title and the subtitle. Now I have a to-do in here, and this is one of the problems that I ran into, was selecting the activity type button. And basically what I mean by selecting the activity type is, if you remember, this pop-up consists of just a stack view of buttons. Let's take a look at it. Okay, let's zoom in here. And the way we show that one of these buttons are selected is we just change the tint color. It's as simple as that. So when we come into this pop-up for edit mode, we want to highlight one of these buttons. By default, the excursion type is selected. So let's see how we're going to do that. Now, first of all, we have this function down here, activity type selected. And that action is connected to all 5 of the activity types. And all it does is it goes through all the activity type buttons and sets the color to accent, which is that dark greenish color. And then it looks at which one was passed in and it sets the tint color for that, the orange color. Well, we're going to use the same function for that. So we're basically just going to call that function. And then we have to know which button we're going to pass in. So remember, the buttons, they're up here. It's an array of buttons, right? So we're going to access that array, activity type buttons. I'll copy that. And then we just want to pick which button out of that array we want to pass in. So how can we get which index we want to use? Well, we want to look at the activity model, and then we want to look at the activity type, and then from there, we're just going to get the raw value. So how does this work? Let's just review this a little bit. The raw value represents the index of the activity type. So if we come in here, this is our activity type enum. We made it into an integer. And what happens when you do this is it assigns a value of 0 to auto. Excursion will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that integer, or that index, matches up perfectly with our array of buttons. So, for example, if we selected an activity that was flight, then that would be index 2, right? So then when we come back here, we're going to look at these buttons. We'll pick the index 2 button, which will be button number 3. And then it'll come into activity selected. It's going to change everything to the theme accent color, which is that dark color. And then it's going to change the third button's color to that orange color. And there you go. So we've covered a lot of code so far. Let's just run the application and see how it's working. Okay, we'll just come into this trip and let's take a look at something here. I'm going to select this activity right here, this flight here. And notice this. The excursion is still selected, and it should be the flight selected. Why wasn't it selected? This took me a long time to figure out, and I found out what it was. The problem has to do with named colors. If we look at this code, the activity type selected does get called, and it does set all these properties, but these properties aren't reflected because what happens is all the colors get changed, and then when viewDidLoad is finished running, it takes our named colors on the storyboard, just like we see here. It takes and applies all of these named colors on top of what we just selected. So the named colors happens second. We change the color first, and then after viewDidLoad, the named colors get applied on top of it. So it keeps overriding our changes. Now there's a couple of ways around it. Is one being we could implement viewDidAppear and change the color there. Well, that doesn't really seem optimum. Another solution is we can just take the tint color on these buttons and just reset them back to the default. And so after we change the colors in our viewDidLoad, it's not going to apply any named colors on top of them. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to select these buttons here. We'll go into the properties, and we're going to change their tint color back to normal. Right here. We're just going to go back to default. Now, after viewDidLoad, it doesn't have a color to apply to them. It's the default, so there's nothing it has to do. So it'll just show our changes instead. So let's run it and test it again. Okay, so remember, the airplane should be selected. And there it is, the airplane's selected. We can try a different one. The hotel should be selected. It's selected. Car should be selected. Car is selected. So just to summarize, when you're working with named colors, the named colors get applied to an object after viewDidLoad. So if you're trying to change the color in viewDidLoad, it's not going to work. Okay, so that part is working. We're effectively taking the activity, we're bringing it into the pop-up, and we're populating the pop-up with all of the existing values of that activity. So number 3 is done. We can cross that one off our list. So let's take a look at number 4 when they save the new activities data. Okay, so let's scroll down to the save function and take a look here. All right, so the save function is kind of broken up into 2 parts. This first part here, this is when you update an activity. And again, we're just looking at the activity model to edit. If it has a value, then we know we're editing. Otherwise, we're going to create a new activity. Now the code in that second part there, the new activity, that's pretty much the same as it was before. There was one slight change that I made, and that is on line 62 there. you notice it says new day index. Well, before it just said day index. I called it new day index because if you look at the function on line 70 when we called our update activity, I wanted to name the parameter the same as the parameter label. So you can see there's a new day index parameter label, and that's why I called it new day index. Okay, so let's just take a look at some of these things here. We have our model, which we passed in. Now we're going to take that existing model, and we're just going to give it new values. So we give it a new activity type, we give it a new title, a new subtitle, and then we call our update activity. And of course, we're going to pass in the old day index, which is the original day index to edit that we passed in. And then we're going to pass in the new day index, which is the new value in the day picker view. Now, of course, like I said before, these two values could be the same. If the user never spins that picker view, then that's totally fine. We can pass in the same values, and we know that that activity is just going to stay in the same day. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do is we want to call this done updating. Now, you notice when we create a new activity, we have a done saving. So why didn't we just use that? Why didn't we use that callback function? Well, it's mostly because of the parameters. Parameters are going to be pretty different because we have that old day index and the new day index. And I really just wanted to keep it separate just because I think it would make maintenance a little bit easier. We're not really losing anything by having two different functions. So we call done updating with the old index, the new index, and then our new activity model that we just updated. Okay, well, that's it for number 4. Now let's take a look at number 5. And this might be the most complicated part of this whole video because there's a lot of things that are happening here. And let's just go over it again, exactly what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do to update the table view. And I'm talking about locally. Locally, we're going to update this table view to reflect our changes. And I'm talking about when we switch days. So we're just looking at the scenario of when we change days. And the first thing we want to do is we want to delete the old activity, which means deleting that row from that section. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to insert the new activity under the new section or the new day. So I'm talking about the backing data, the backing variable that supplies this table view. That's what we're going to be deleting and inserting into. And then the last step we want to do is we want to reflect those changes on the table view itself, on the UI. And I'll show you how that's done. Let's head back into our project, and we're going to go back into the activities view controller here. Okay, and that's when we're going to look at this done updating. So again, we pass in the old index, the new index, and then we also have our activity model. So remember, at this point, our remote data store is updated. That's all taken care of. We don't have to worry about that. All we're focusing on here in this done updating is updating the local data store and the table view. Because otherwise, we don't want to have to make another trip, a second trip to our remote data store and pull all that data down just to refresh our trip. It's too expensive. We can save that money. All right, let me make a little bit more room here. Now, some of this might be looking familiar to you. We come in here, we get the old activity index, and that's where the activity was. And then we do a comparison. We look at the old day index, and does it equal the new day index? If it does, then that's easier because we're just updating everything in the same place. The activity is staying in the same day. So we update the local data table, which is we're finding the existing activity model, and we're just overriding it with our new activity model, which has all of our changes in it. And then we want to refresh just that single row. So what we do is a table view reload rows, and we do it at just the path, the index path of where that activity is. Easy enough. Now the harder part is when we're moving it to a different day. So when the old index does not equal the new index, then we know it's going to a different day. So remember the 2 steps. We want to remove it from the old location and insert it into the new location. So that's the first thing we do here is we do a remove at and we pass in the old activity index. And you might notice that this looks kind of like our update function in our activities functions, right? Activity model functions. Yeah, so we get the last index because we don't know where the user wants it in that day, and there's no way for us to ask them. So when they switch days, we don't know where it's going in that day. There's no way for us to know. So we're just going to append it to the end. So that's why we get the last index first. We get the last index, and then the next line we call here is we're inserting it onto that last index. And now that I think about this, we probably don't have to do an insert at index. I bet we could just do an append, because when we reorder rows, it's not going to be calling this functionality. This is only done updating when we update a model. So that's an option for you guys. You can try appending it to the end, and I bet it'll work perfectly. Okay, step number 3 here. This is where we're going to reflect what just happened. So we've updated the local data store. Now we could call it tableview.reloadData. We could do that, but it's not going to look fancy. Put simply, it's not going to look fancy. You're not going to see a nice little, delete happen on the row and an insert into a new section. Those things all contribute to user experience. It gives it a nice feel, a nice touch. So we're going to spend a little bit of time making it look a little bit fancier and, improving the user experience here. So we're going to call it perform batch updates. And what that does is allows you to do multiple manipulations to the table at one time. And remember, you always want to do this part last. You always update the table view's underlying data first, and then you perform the batch updates, like the delete rows, the insert rows. You always perform those second. If you don't, you get this index mismatch error. So we perform the batch updates. We delete the rows using the index paths that we already have, and then we insert rows using that index path information. Now, what's going to happen here is it uses this index path information to get the correct data out of its underlying data model. What's really happening here when it calls insert rows is it's calling get cell at index path, and it's using this index path, and that, get row at index path. Or was it get cell at index path? No, it's oh my God. Cell for row at index path is what I'm thinking. Just calls this using the index path that we provide. And then this function knows how to access our data, get the right data that it needs, and create that new row. Okay, so should we test it out? Yeah, let's try it out. Okay, so let's try this. Let's move this flight up to April 8th. I'll swipe here, click edit, and we'll change days. And we'll give it a description here. Then we'll click save. There we go. So you saw some animation there. You saw it delete from April 9th, and you saw it insert into April 8th. Now let's make another change. And again, it gets appended to the end because right now we don't have any way to reorder just from that pop-up. There's no way we can really do it. I will be showing you how to do that in the next video though. So let's try something else. We'll move this to the day after. I'll move it to April 9th. And maybe we'll change it to, we'll say it's an excursion. And there you go. It got inserted at the bottom, and it now has the new icon for an excursion. All right, so there you go, guys. We just completed number 5 and number 6. And we did them at the same time because they're both in the, done updating callback function. All right, guys, that's it for this video. We covered a lot of things, so feel free to watch it as much as possible. You'll probably have to pause it, update your code, test it out, try it at each step along the way. So I hope you enjoyed this review of some things that you learned earlier in this course. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you haven't done already. We've gone through a lot of videos, so you should be subscribed by now. I'd be surprised if you weren't. Consider adding a translation for your native language. That helps people in your country or who speak your language find these videos. And thanks, and keep climbing that big mountain to be a great developer.